when we are talking about the region that is these days called the Western Balkans, we have to think about the origins of Yugoslavia as a country that emerged from the Second World War. Yugoslavia emerged from the war as a real multi-ethnic composition of member states of a federation. Because the idea was, and it emerged before the end of the war, that Yugoslavia will be organized as a federal state. Since 1945, Yugoslavia included Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia as member states of the federation, with equal rights in governing and running the country. Besides the formal composition of different member states, it was a multi-ethnic federation as such, because all the countries I mentioned, all the member countries I mentioned, were populated by a certain defined ethnic group: Slovenians, Croats, Serbs, Macedonians, Montenegrins, with the exception of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was the multi-ethnic country within the multi-ethnic federation, the only really multi-ethnic country. This is important to understand because this will come back to haunt the breakup of Yugoslavia after, during the war, or coinciding with the breakup of Yugoslav Federation in 1991-92. So we have to ask ourselves, what was the glue to keep those peoples together in the Yugoslav Federation? Starting with the Second World War legacy, I could say that there was a very distinguished pride of all Yugoslavs of beating the Nazism. Yugoslavia emerged from the war as a victorious country, together with allies, together with alliance against fascism and Nazism. And in that respect, Yugoslavia, as a small country, as a rather weak country, looked as something special in international relations in those times. Of course, with the division of the European continent between East and West, between the US control and the Soviet control, Yugoslavia somehow at the beginning was seen as belonging to the Eastern Bloc of the countries. However, the emergence of the leader Josip Broz Tito, who led the anti-fascist struggle in Yugoslavia, who led the Communist Party of Yugoslavia as the organizers of the resistance, simply realized at some point that being a satellite country to the Soviet Union is leading Yugoslav peoples to nowhere, basically. And as is well known in history, of course, he said the historical no to Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, and simply decided to lead the country in some sort of independent way, to give it an independent path. It was very difficult, let's face it, because the whole world in those times, in fact, was divided between the two options. And we know that period as a Cold War, which grew and grew and became, very, very cold by the passage of time. So maintaining some sort of neutrality or independence, I mean political neutrality, of course, in that environment, in that context, was very difficult. What I think was realized by the leadership of Yugoslavia and Tito is that there are lots of countries, there are dozens and dozens of countries in the world, in particular immediately after anti-colonial liberation, immediately after former colonies acquiring independence and sovereignty, many countries that simply were reluctant to join one side or the other. No West, no East for them. And from that particular political or fresh ideas, I think, a project was born which was called the Movement of Non-Allied Countries. Simply countries that wouldn't support neither American, neither Russian or Soviet way of running the world in those times. And for many reasons, maybe for the reason of his age, maybe for the reasons of the Yugoslav role in the Second World War, Tito was seen as a leader, or maybe the leader of the non-allied world. Together in those times, at the beginning, with Nehru from India, Nasser from Egypt, and a few others. Why I'm saying all this? I mean, the position of Yugoslavia as a small, not very developed European countries in those times, the position of Yugoslavia made Yugoslav people very, very proud. And that was one of the glues that would bring people together. People were very proud just feeling Yugoslavs, although it was, being a multi-ethnic country, of course, the entire population of Yugoslavia had their respective ethnic or religious backgrounds. And maybe people would think of themselves and identify themselves as such, you know, with that differences in Yugoslavia. But looking abroad, you know, they all felt like Yugoslavs, more or less. So I think that that's a kind of dichotomy that needs to be understood in order to understand how Yugoslavia kept together from 1945 till 1990, 1991. Interestingly enough, that pride of anti-fascist Yugoslavia has lasted for 2 or 3 generations. Even now, you will find young people very proud about the past. Of course, neo-fascism in the former Yugoslavia, in the West Balkans, is there as anywhere in Europe these days. That legacy of anti-fascist struggle, legacy of unity, legacy of being important in the global world as a non-allied country, I think meant that people had a sense of belonging to Yugoslavia. I think that's an important point to make. Sense of belonging in today's Bosnia and Herzegovina, if you want to jump, you know, half a century, is non-existent, almost non-existent. To summarize this this idea of unifying forces of peoples living in Yugoslavia. So the legacy of the anti-fascist struggle during the Second World War, then a non-aligned movement, or the role in the world that was completely inadequate to the power of the country. It was just a, you know, political strength with very little behind that in terms of economy, in terms of armament, in terms of population of Yugoslavia. But and also, of course, something that was seen very vividly is a difference in quality of life when compared with the Soviet Union. I mentioned that Yugoslavia somehow escaped to be a member of the bloc of socialist country controlled by the Soviet Union. But not only that, Yugoslavia kept a kind of open society idea. Although it was a country of a one and only political party, which is very strange. and there were no multi-party elections in Yugoslavia. The only political party that was kind of being elected was the Communist Party. But in reality, people were rather relaxed about that. Standard of living was relatively high. Even during the austerity in Yugoslavia, the beginning of 80s, beginning of 80s, people would call it stable stagnation. So there was no dramatic drop in quality of life and standard of living in comparison with Eastern Europe. The period of austerity in Yugoslavia, which somehow was quite visible at the beginning of the 80s, did not affect the quality of life or standard of living in Yugoslavia, and people were referring to that period as a stable stagnation. So, you know, there was no improvement, but still, we are okay. And in that respect, also, during this period until the 80s, we all realized that there is a cult of personality linked to Tito, to President Tito, and he was elected president of life, and he was given all sorts of allocates, which didn't make much sense. But nevertheless, I think that was compensated. That was compensated in the mind of the people by an effective and efficient role that Yugoslavia played between East and West. And of course, I think subconsciously, probably many people would do checks and balances and say, we are losing on the side of democracy, but we are winning on the side of the role of Yugoslavia in the world. We are winning on the side that we could buy a foreign currency to travel abroad, that our passports were laissez-passer anywhere in the world except for the big powers of those times. So in that respect, there was some kind of weighing between negative and positive. When I mentioned the early 80s, of course, this brings me to a very important turning point in the Yugoslav history, Tito's death. He died in you caught me here. In 1980. Okay. He died in 1980. And Yugoslavia somehow managed for the next 5 to 7 years. But then we all realized that the days of Yugoslav life were outnumbered. Why I'm saying this? First of all, Tito provided one of those unifying elements of different peoples of Yugoslavia. It was based, let me just repeat briefly, it was based on his cult of personality. It was based on his enormous success internationally. It was based on his easygoing way of running a country with just one political party. I mean, dissent was minimal in Yugoslavia. There were no serious internal problems while he was there, while he was around. After his death, I think rudimentary nationalism started emerging among Yugoslav leadership. And people, of course, but I think the leadership realized, in fact, that they were not able to sustain the country as it was, and somehow turned on to big ideas about national pride. And you have to remember that there was not one. Yugoslavia was not one and only nation. There were a number of ethnic groups, number of nationalities, and simply the new leadership after Tito had nothing to offer in terms of uh, of the benefits in terms of privileges that existed during the previous period. And of course, the crisis of communist system and later on the fall of the wall of Berlin, I think were like a masterstroke for Yugoslavia. So Tito's death, among other things, meant that Yugoslavia lost its special position in international affairs. And I think that that was very confusing, and it was very disappointing for Yugoslav people, because they lost that position themselves when they went abroad, when they received foreign dignitaries. There was very little that was left for Yugoslavia as a factor in international affairs, in global affairs. The following element would be the loss of trust internally in Yugoslavia, because different nations or different member states of the federation that were called republics, different republics had a different strategy, or their elites had a different strategy about the future of Yugoslavia in order to keep the country together. So there were deep differences between Slovenia on one hand, Serbia on the other, Croatia again on the one hand, Serbia on the other. Bosnia was a special case, we'll come to that later. So there were too many uncertainties, and with the weakening of the Eastern European bloc and the fall of communism, we are coming now to that, and the fall of communism, an enormous gap opened in the field of ideology, in the area of ideology. People simply were disoriented, they didn't know where to go ideologically, and that gap was filled almost overnight by nationalism. And people grabbed the nationalism effortlessly, because, you know, to become a nationalist, you don't have to invest any effort in it. You just have to say that, you know, I'm a good Serb, I'm a good Croat, and that's it. And you're admitted to the club. So in that respect, I think that Yugoslavia completely was left without any sort of vision among population. That vision was broke up in different segments and somehow labeled with different nationalistic ideas. And obviously that mosaic of different nationalisms could not cope together. It was very difficult to find a coexisting element, coexisting point of 6 or 7 nationalisms in Yugoslavia. Just to add to that, it's interesting that the former communists so easily switched from a global Yugoslav, pan-Yugoslavism idea to nationalistic ideas. There was nothing that would prevent them to do that, and it was appealing in a way, because they saw themselves again as proud nationalists, as proud citizens or members of their own ethnic group. I think, of course, the question we have to ask ourselves was that tension or tensions among different nations in Yugoslavia, where could those tensions be resolved without the war? The answer, of course, is not simple, but we have to realize, in fact, that the nationalisms were driving towards ethnic territories, clear ethnic territories, which brought them to the strategy of ethnic cleansing, let's have my nation rule the country, rule certain territory, with no other people living there. It was so openly expressed by the national or nationalistic elites that inevitably it would lead to an armed conflict. Because how can you expel people who lived for generations in a certain area together with the others? Maybe not kissing or loving each other, you know, but still coexisting. And I think that was an alarm, you know, for many people who realized that there is no life, there was no life beyond Yugoslav coexistence, internal coexistence. And then, of course, certain incidents started emerging across Yugoslavia, you know, from Slovenia down to Macedonia, following by an all-out war. Of course, I mean, the purpose of our interview is to talk more about Bosnia and Herzegovina than anything else. For the record, I'm not prepared to talk at length about the war in Slovenia or the war in Croatia, because, you know, I spent the best part of my life in Bosnia and Herzegovina and experienced the war and the siege of Sarajevo myself. So in that respect, there is a question that emerged immediately, or together with the tensions in the former Yugoslavia. And having said that on Yugoslavia's foundation, having said all that about Yugoslav foundations or Yugoslav unifying ground, in fact, it's difficult to ignore the similarity between Yugoslavia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Yugoslavia was a multi-ethnic state, a big federation. Bosnia-Herzegovina was a small member state of that federation, but both were multi-ethnic in their essence. And then, of course, again, the rhetoric question was, and I think Henry Kissinger played with the words when he said that if Yugoslavia is breaking up along the ethnic lines, what is going to keep Bosnia-Herzegovina together? Unfortunately, it was shown during the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina between 92 and 95 that any sort of a common state was extremely difficult to envisage, extremely difficult to envisage. And now I'm going to jump a little bit, but now when you think about Bosnia-Herzegovina, when you see what's happening there 25 years after the Dayton Agreement, which stopped the war in Bosnia, you can see that the country is ineffective, that at least two ethnic groups, Serbs and Croats in Bosnia, have no sense of belonging to that country. The third ethnic group, Bosnian Muslims, or Bosniaks, as the official name is, think of Bosnia in pre-war terms, like a, you know, unified country, centralized, unitary, as the term is in political vocabulary these days. So in that respect, it is really the question for the future generations: what is the way out for Bosnia-Herzegovina? For a quarter of a century, the system that was established immediately after the war and confirmed and legalized or legitimized by the Dayton Agreement, the system is not working. Bosnia-Herzegovina was multi-ethnic to the core. There were intermarriages among the three ethnic groups in Bosnia-Herzegovina, you know, in the old times, in the former Yugoslavia. So in many respects, people lived together, worked together, made love together, So, so of course, as I said, for Yugoslavia, it can be even in a stronger argued for Bosnia and Herzegovina, that okay, people were Serbs, people were Croats, people were Muslims or Bosniaks, people were Russian Orthodox, people were Catholics, people were Muslims by religion, and that was acknowledged among population, but it didn't matter. That's the point I want to make. It was when a Bosniak married a Bosnian Serb, Muslim married a Bosnian Serb, it wasn't like everybody was asking or everybody was saying this. Oh, it was a inter-religion or inter-ethnic marriage. No, people simply find themselves in love, decided to get married. So, in particular in urban areas, and I can speak for Sarajevo, where I lived the best part of my life. I can speak for Sarajevo that sort of division simply did not matter. Somehow it was probably ironed by the system, by the communist system in those times. It was probably more relaxed than in other parts of Yugoslavia, because Bosnia and Herzegovina traditionally, historically, for centuries, was of mixed ethnic background. Population was of mixed ethnic background. So in that respect, Bosnia at some point, Bosnia had a privilege. It benefited from its mixed ethnic population. On the other hand, it was a curse with the breakup of Yugoslavia, because the larger framework was lost. The fallback option didn't exist anymore. You have to somehow arrange your political relationships, your social, cultural relationships. You had to organize as an independent country. The important point is that since the Bosnian nation did not exist, was not acknowledged in the former Yugoslavia as such, Bosnia was acknowledged as Bosnia and Herzegovina as a member state of the federation, with the knowledge that Bosnia and Herzegovina is populated by Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Croats, and Bosnian Muslims. And that was a fact that was appreciated by the Yugoslav authorities, and in Bosnia was handled in a quite good, I should say, relaxed way. So people who were searching for the expression of Bosnian nationalism in comparison with Serbian or Croatian nationalism won't find the answer, because there was no clear Bosnian identity based on ethnic or religious background. The first multi-party elections were held in Bosnia in November 1990. Those were the first multi-party elections, and national parties, calling themselves different names, but definitely they would include only the population of a certain ethnic group. National parties, of course, were admitted to have their candidates at the election, with the former communist and a reformist party, which was a new appearance on the political horizon in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As a result of those elections, we were faced with national parties winning the elections throughout in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and creating some sort of a coalition, promising to the public that they will rule the country in a coalition, that they will rule the country in some sort of alliance among themselves. That alliance could not hold more than a couple of months, and first the political conflict that emerged through all the parliaments in Bosnia and Herzegovina, different levels of parliaments in Bosnia and Herzegovina, simply led to the war. The Serbs created their own autonomous regions in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Croats did the same in the south of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Herzegovina region, while Bosniaks were in a very difficult position. They insisted that Bosnia and Herzegovina should remain a unique country, a unique state for all the people who lived there. But they also realized that having control, political control or ethnic control in certain areas of Bosnia and Herzegovina will work for the benefit. So everybody projected some sort of areas of Bosnia and Herzegovina where they will be unquestionable rulers, ethnically, politically, religiously. And at the end of the day, that was the result of the war, 3 or 4 years later. So with the breakup of Yugoslavia, it was almost required, and I don't want to go into too many details, but the European communities, or the European Union as it's called now, required from Yugoslavia, in order to resolve its differences by peaceful means, required for each republic to have a referendum on independence. And it was thought in Brussels then that the referendum was a vehicle somehow to bring the country into a different era, with possibly a few independent states emerging out of the Yugoslav Federation, but by the will of population, not resorting to the armed conflict. And the European Union appointed a Badinter Commission, chaired by a former French foreign minister, Badinter, who in fact suggested, okay, fine, Yugoslavia can disintegrate, secession will be possible, will be acknowledged by the European Union if you do it by referendum. So the referendum was held in Slovenia, and that was pretty easy because, as far as I remember, I think 97% of population were Slovenians in Slovenia. And of course, Belgrade, as the capital of Yugoslavia, protested, and they were trying to protect that small minority of Montenegrins and Serbs living in Slovenia. They were very much very much disturbed by the position and the future of the Yugoslav National Army units stationed in Slovenia, while the country was still, in one piece. And then they provoked a short-lived conflict of about a week in Slovenia, just to show the might of the Yugoslav National Army then. But that was almost forgotten. In Croatia, the referendum in Croatia was a serious business, because in Croatia, traditionally, there was a national minority of about 16% of Serbs living there for generations. And that already showed that a referendum in a multi-ethnic society is extremely complex and risky business. And then, of course, Serbia proper supported the Serb minority in Croatia. The war broke out, and and really lasted for too long, with lots of losses and devastation of Croatia itself and the population in Croatia. And then finally, the Serb population was almost to the last expelled from the Republic of Croatia, making Croatia what the elite, what the political elite wanted, in fact, a pure Croat country. And that was the whole idea, ethnic cleansing, what I mentioned before. Well, the referendum in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that was a big question, because from the very beginning of the discussion on referendum, the Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina were opposing it. They were opposing the eventual independence. They were opposing the secession of Bosnia and Herzegovina from Yugoslavia, because according to the census of estimate of 1992, there were 33% of Serbs, 44% of Muslims, and 17% of Croats living in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we can go by majority of population, but even Serbs and Croats, who were in minorities in comparison with Bosnian Muslims, had a huge percentage of the population. And from the very beginning, as I said, Serbs supported by Serbia proper opposed any sort of referendum in that respect. However, within the political agreement, Bosniak or Muslim and Croat political establishment agreed on the referendum. The Serbs abstained, and the next thing was resorting to the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Again, with the same premise as in dissolving Yugoslavia, creating national or ethnic territories, resorting to ethnic cleansing. I think loss of trust among leaderships of different member states of the Federation, and then reducing that to Bosnia, loss of trust between the leaders of ethnic political parties. Loss of trust. I think that it may sound very simple, but in fact it was like he said this or that, but that we could accept, but in reality he's going to do something else, and that said to your own community would stir the water absolutely. Loss of trust, warmongering, and something that really was shown clearly at the elections as early as in 1990, November. I keep returning to that election because the election campaign on all three sides was about the same or very similar. It was like, you must not vote for anybody else but for your ethnic party, because the other two will vote for their ethnic party, and we are going to be the losers at the end. And you just you just distribute that to all three, you will get the answer. Yes, okay. It was really, I think, unfortunately, Giuseppe, unfortunately, it's such a happy and secure society that lasted, for a couple of decades. What happened, in fact, that with nationalism, with loss of this cohesive factor in Yugoslavia, individuals were made to face the wall, you see, and declare that their ethnic background. Some of them really didn't care before, maybe didn't know even. If you're coming from a mixed marriage, okay, in my case, my father was a Serb. His parents were of Russian Orthodox religion. My mother comes from an old Jewish family. What am I? Some people say, you're Jewish because your mother was Jewish. I don't care. I don't give a damn. You know, and people like myself, in fact, fled the country. And there's a very popular anecdote among Sarajevans here in London. They say, all Bosnian and Herzegovinian left the country, and all Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats stayed in the country. I'm always speaking from my personal experience. I have never lived in a rural area. I have a few acquaintances who never lived in urban areas, and okay, they feel differently about these issues than people from big cities. Same here. Look at Brexit. London voted what? Nottingham voted what? I mean, why? They're all English. Yeah, but there is something in the experience. There is something of the legacy that the life in a certain environment would affect you. The problem with identifying the conflicting parties or warring parties was that Bosnian Muslims were really left completely unarmed. The Serbian political establishment managed somehow to get the Yugoslav National Army weaponry stationed in Bosnia and Herzegovina under their control. Croats, of course, were extremely well placed because they were helped by the new regime in Croatia, Mr. Tudjman's regime, which sent the army of the Republic of Croatia to fight in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So at the very beginning, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina was so chaotic, was so confusing for an observer, because it appeared on the war theater that everybody was fighting everybody. And normally, foreign observers or foreign intelligence, they would come to Bosnia or observe the situation in Bosnia, and they were asking, who's fighting who? And there's a wonderful anecdote. When the American intelligence agents came back to Washington, D.C., they were debriefed by the officials of the Ministry of Defense and, analysts there. And I said, okay, fine, but who is fighting who? And they were told by the intelligence officers that there were three factions, Serbs, Croats, Muslims, and they are fighting for ethnically clean, ethnically proper territories to govern, to expelling everybody else. And there are three parties, and they are fighting among themselves. And then an analyst of the Ministry of Defense said, well, according to the war literature, that's not possible. You have to have two parties fighting each other. You can't have three enemies, fighting each other. And according to that anecdote, what happened was that the Americans decided to bring two parties against one. So they tried all the alternatives, like, let's unify, let's put together Serbs and Croats against Muslims. Because, in parentheses, it was for them extremely difficult to realize or to make a decision which party to support. Who are the bad guys? Who are the good guys? In this story, all three were bad guys or good guys. It depends, from which point you're making an assessment. But in any case, they decided to turn two parties against one party. They tried to unify Serbs and Croats against Muslims. It didn't work because the Serbs had committed all sorts of atrocities in Croatia already, so it was out of question. To bring together Serbs and Muslims against Croats. Already Serbs have done tremendous harm in central Bosnia, killing or committing all sorts of war crimes in central Bosnia, in the villages, and siege of Sarajevo and all that. Okay, so the only solution was to somehow persuade Muslims and Croats to fight against the Serbs. And on the premises of that solution, of that idea, Washington Agreement was signed. In fact, the negotiations were held in Vienna, and it was in the spring of 1994. In spring of 1994, negotiations were completed between Croat leadership and Bosnian Muslim leadership, and Washington Agreement was signed, creating a body which is still called the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. It will require you to read a little bit about it, but the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina was structured as a unified, as a unique entity in Bosnia-Herzegovina, composed of Muslim population and Croat population in Bosnia-Herzegovina. From that moment on, Muslims in Bosnia-Herzegovina were renamed for political reasons as Bosniaks. Bosniaks, and you will find that term in the literature from then on. The interesting point is that at the moment when Washington Agreement or Washington negotiations were held, the Serbs were out of the story because the international community refused to talk to the Serbs, refused to bring them in negotiations because of the war crimes, and their leaders were already indicted for the war crimes in those times. So they were out of the question. And interestingly enough, when the Washington Agreement was signed, there was a provision in the agreement, which is still there. There was a provision in the agreement that the Republic of Croatia and the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina will form eventually a confederation between Zagreb and Sarajevo, to make it quite clear. That has never happened, of course, because when the Americans entered the show after the Washington Agreement, they wanted to bring all three parties together and somehow stop the war. They bombed Bosnia, or Serbian positions in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in the summer and in the early autumn of 1995, brought all the parties in Dayton, in the United States, in Ohio, United States, and forced them, into 3-week negotiations. And another anecdote, Bill Clinton was the president, and Richard Holbrooke was the main negotiator. You know the name of Richard Holbrooke, I'm sure. And I don't know what his position was. I think he was just maybe a senator, not quite. And then, the negotiations were going on and on, on and on. Everybody's talking about historical interests of different ethnic groups in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and history, and then the negotiations were nearing the Thanksgiving Day, the main holiday in the United States. Mm-hmm. I think that it's usually in the last week of November, okay? And Bill Clinton phoned Richard Holbrooke and said, "How it's going down there?" And he said, "Well, difficult, twisting hands here and there, but it doesn't help very much." And President Clinton said to Holbrooke, Richard, if you don't get the agreement by Thanksgiving Day, bomb them all. So eventually, yeah, they signed the Dayton Agreement, and they brought. And in fact, the Dayton Agreement was signed in Paris, because what was agreed in Dayton in December or late November was brought to Paris in December to a big conference. And at the conference, the guarantor of the Dayton Agreement were the big powers, and of course the participants. So Milosevic signed the agreement on behalf of Bosnian Serbs. Tudjman signed the agreement on behalf of Bosnian Croats, and Alija Izetbegović, then nominal president of Bosnia and Herzegovina, signed the agreement on behalf of Bosniaks. After the signing of the Washington Agreement without the Serbs, now the Serbs were brought in, because the international community decision or strategy was to maintain Bosnia and Herzegovina as an independent state, and bring the Serbs back as 1/3 of the population as they were before the war. So according to that strategy, in fact, they negotiated two entities as a composing parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a state. So the entity that was approved to the Serbs was Republika Srpska, or the Serb Republic. And the other entity was already formed Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which included Bosniaks and Croats. The reason why they finally went back to the previous position that all 6 member states or republics of Yugoslavia may become independent states, in the meantime, during the war, they realized that the other option, the alternative, was that the Croats will simply go to the Republic of Croatia and bring their territory with them, so to speak, to the Republic of Croatia. And the Serbs, from the very beginning, in fact, they said that they didn't want to live with Croats and Bosniaks in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They would rather make some sort of alliance with Serbia and eventually become a part of Serbia proper. I think that the realization in the international community was that that is going to be impossible in terms of a continuous conflict, of a further ethnic cleansing. And in the meantime, of course, Milosevic was indicted for war crimes. So, you know, I think that the whole strategy of the Serbs simply collapsed because of that. And Tudjman, of course, to save the face before the international community, in front of the international community, gave up on his on grabbing the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where Croats lived in a majority. And that were the reasons, at least my opinion was that was the reason for bringing all 3 peoples together in Bosnia and Herzegovina within the borders that existed in the Yugoslav Federation. Well, I think that the presence of the international community in the form of, first in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the form of UNPROFOR, UN Protection Force, was welcomed by the population for exactly the reasons that people anticipated, that they will protect them. That they will protect the civilian population. But on the other hand, behind that face was this unity in the international community, was a different approach to the role of UNPROFOR. because the mandate that was given was peacekeeping, while people immediately reacted and saying, well, there is no peace. What they are going to keep? So the international community shied away from any form of peacemaking by the UN forces, or later on NATO forces in Bosnia and Herzegovina, putting them in a more active position, putting them in a more risky position if you want, but still according to the mandate and in accordance what would Chapter 7 of the UN Charter require from an international military force. It is true that I mean they did an enormously complex and difficult function, the blue helmets or the UN forces, but they never got involved. Actually, there were no instance, except for a few incidents, there were no instances where they would get involved, simply deterring one side attacking the other, or vice versa. And I remember living in Sarajevo in those times under the siege. They were ridiculed by the population of Sarajevo when they said that they were counting the shells and mortars falling on the city, killing civilians. Like, you know, the Serbs fired, I don't know, 1,300 mortars in 24 hours. Okay, that could have served as a good evidence, or as a good evidence in the tribunal trying people for war crimes later on. But actually at the war theater, it looked rather meaningless to the people. You see, from the very beginning of the breakup of Yugoslavia, the international community didn't have a clue what to do, actually. There was on one hand, you can say there were differences between Europe and the United States. On the other hand, neither side knew enough about it. And I can tell you from my own experience that for decades, a foreign ambassador sitting in Belgrade, American, British, or Russian, Soviet ambassador, would not move from Belgrade anywhere else. All the information they got about Yugoslavia was produced locally. All the contacts they had were limited to that center of politics, center of culture, center of institutions, basically. I mean, I remember that the first British ambassador who came to Sarajevo, and I hosted him for a couple of days there, was Peter Hall, British ambassador who served until the very beginning of the breakup of Yugoslavia. And for that reason, I think that the mandate that the UN forces had was incomplete and rather confusing, even for people who were in charge of executing that mandate. You know, my department of international, I was professor of public international law then at Sarajevo faculty. We developed a project of establishing an international protectorate over Bosnia and Herzegovina. And that project was researched, drafted as early as in 1990. And the idea was to have state institutions of Bosnia and Herzegovina controlled by the international community, controlled by advisors at least, media controlled by the international community. Why? In order to stop hate speech and war propaganda. And we thought that it could have been done. I'm not going to go into too many details, but just a few days before the war officially started in Bosnia and Herzegovina, after the referendum for independence of the country, I went to the headquarters of UNPROFOR, that was already working there. Myself and a couple of colleagues went to meet with the chief of staff of UNPROFOR, a Canadian general, and a civilian chief of civilian sector of UNPROFOR, an Irish diplomat. And we argued for the project. I simply made an expose. I told them that in simple terms, you have to bring enough soldiers to keep the country under control. We have to somehow take the tension down of hate speech and warmongering and all that. And their reaction was that United Nations deployed a few thousand soldiers in Bosnia and Herzegovina at the very beginning. And the general asked me, do you have any idea how many soldiers will have to be deployed in your country if the international protectorate was anticipated? I said, I'm not a soldier, I have no idea, it's for you to guess. And he said, at least 60,000, at least 60,000. Okay, it didn't mean much to me. But nevertheless, I said, okay, well, if you can't afford it, you can't afford it. It's going to be a all-out war. And let me jump to 1995. The Dayton Agreement was signed. In the meantime, during the war, over 100,000 people, to a very modest estimate, lost their lives in the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And finally, throughout that period, the number of deployed soldiers reached 50,000. So that's end of story. All cases are probably different. Okay. Similarities are here and there, but the differences are huge. In fact, in the case of Yugoslavia, there was a generational experience of people living together. And living together in a developed, in a modern society, in Europe, for God's sake, wasn't it? But in principle, I am interventionist. I don't think that there is any moral value in big powers sitting behind in an armchair, really, and looking people killing each other in Afghanistan or somewhere in Africa or Middle East, doing nothing, basically. In fact, quite the opposite, setting fire here and there for their own interests. In the case of Bosnia-Herzegovina, I think from this emotional and time distance, I really think that the big powers or Americans waited for the right moment. They waited for the situation to get ripe enough in the way that they could intervene and simply keep the status quo, which was reached by the summer of 1995. I do not adhere to conspiracy theories, but this may sound like one. Just to give you an example, when Croat forces, from the Republic of Croatia, when Croat forces expelled the Serbs from Krajina in Croatia, they were on their way to take Banja Luka, the stronghold of Serbs and the center of the Serb Republic, you see. And then they were stopped. They were told, no, we'll bomb the Serbs and keep them where they are. So they will have their Republika Srpska, ethnically cleansed, almost. No Bosniaks, no Croats living there. Some numbers that can be ignored. Bosniaks can be happy with the situation in central Bosnia. They have control of that. Croats, definitely Herzegovina is in their hands. So I think that probably, look, from the British perspective, British understand the world in a divided patterns. You know, India was colonially liberated, but then they realized, in fact, that India as a whole would not exist as a peaceful country. Okay, let's take Pakistan as a separate country. And you can name so many examples like that. And really, and there is a practical reason for that. Let's achieve a makeup of Bosnia and Herzegovina that we will be able to control. Having two entities, you know, so we deal with Dodik in Banja Luka, we deal with the guys in Sarajevo, we deal with the guys in Mostar controlling Herzegovina, and that's it. And they waited with Kosovo as well. They bombed Milosevic when the situation in Kosovo came to the point where it will be governable in the future by the international community. Okay. While Kosovo was really multi-ethnic, there was nothing the international community could do. But then with the exit of the Serbs from Kosovo, with expelling most of the Serbs from Kosovo, strengthening Albanian-run or Kosovo-run institutions, they realized, okay, this is it. You know, let them have the unilateral declaration of independence, and we'll run the show afterwards. I think that the Europe was different in the early 90s, wasn't it? And political correctness did not dominate us as much as now in expressing, you know, the visions of the world. But it is true that Europe, not only that I will use the word Brussels as a synonym, okay? It's not only that the Brussels would not want a Muslim country in Europe. It's more that the Brussels had no clue how to handle such a community in Europe, which is shown, you know, by the emergence of immigrants in Europe now. They simply don't know what to do, you know. They simply, how can Europe handle the situation where a group of Muslims coming with an open heart, with high expectations, coming to Switzerland and building a mosque? You know, it's inconceivable for the heads of Brexiteers, just to give you one example. But yes, my prediction for the future that I'm not going to live long enough to see it, but I can tell you that Sarajevo is becoming a Muslim enclave in the heart of Europe.
And it was not before the war?
Oh no, oh no.
Wasn't?
No, far from it, far from it. And I think, in fact, if you go back a little, you realize that what Karadžić and his attack on contemporary 20th century Bosnia and Herzegovina were the goal that he had in his mind was to expose the Muslim elements of the population, the religious elements of the population, show to the world, look, we are fighting against Muslims, we are fighting against Muslim terrorism.
Well, the Turks, as they call
Turks, of course, yeah. And on the other hand, I mean, let's be honest. On the other hand, countries like Kuwait, Iran, couldn't wait for a better opportunity, you know, to infiltrate Europe. I mean, Bosnia and Herzegovina was full of Iran, even now, Iranian spies. You know, it was a God-given opportunity for them. There was no other country, European, modern country, invited, even they were invited by the leadership. Ali Izetbegovic said, look, brothers, we have no arms, we have been attacked, our people are massacred, help us. Same happened with Tudjman, you know. Tudjman was left without arms. Why? Because the Serbs were in control of the armament. They managed somehow to put it under their control in the years approaching the war. And Tudjman, when he was attacked by the Yugoslav army, he appealed to the Ustashis, emigres who were living in Canada, United States, Southern America, and they brought in millions of dollars, bought the weaponry and all that. But from today's point of view, neither Tudjman nor Ali Izetbegović were real European Democrats. Because if they were democratic leaders and Europeans, and they tried to present themselves to the general public, they would have said to their mujahideens or their Ustashis, look, gentlemen, my people will be thankful historically for your help, but now we are in a position to build a modern European democratic country. Thank you very much, go back home. No, they stayed in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they stayed in Croatia, and this is the seeds of neo-fascism, what is called in Croatia. I don't know what to call it in Bosnia. Fundamentalism, Muslim fundamentalism, in fact. Bosnia and Herzegovina can survive and can face a kind of distant future as a country only by organizing itself internally as a federation of three peoples. I don't see any other option. If Bosniaks would insist on a unitary state controlled from the center, be it in Sarajevo or someplace else, the other two wouldn't accept it. Why? Because they have a spare country to relate to. You know, Bosnian Serbs have Serbia, Bosnian Croats have Zagreb, Croatia. They can always, I don't think they would emigrate there, but they can always ask their mother countries, okay, adopt us please, because, you know, we are endangered here by Muslim fundamentalism. And then, of course, Bosniaks would never accept, at least the situation now is such, they would never accept the partition of Bosnia and Herzegovina again. I mean, administrative partition for real. And of course, there are some idealistic projections like, you know, let's anticipate that Yugoslavia can be brought together as a loose confederation. No, I mean, please,
that would be really ambitious, I guess.
Too ambitious, and it doesn't make sense, really. It doesn't make sense. I mean, I don't believe in that.